Welcome, Duke alumni and friends, to this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute, an interdisciplinary educational program organized into thematic courses. I am Tish Futrell, the Director of Academic Engagement on the Lifelong Learning team. And thank you again for joining our program, Building a Sports Dynasty. This program is part of our theme, Contextualizing 100 Years at Duke, which will examine the economic, societal, technological, and social layers that built Duke's foundation and made it into the university it is today. Today's program is the fifth and final session in our series, Contextualizing 100 Years at Duke, and it will explore how our university has evolved into one of the most recognized brands in college athletics. Joining us this evening as our host and moderator is Hosea Chang, co-chair of the Duke Asian Alumni Alliance. Hosea graduated from Duke in 2003 and is now the Chief Operating Officer at Hayden Global, where he oversees operations for various apparel brands, including Hayden Los Angeles and Hayden Girls. Hosea is passionate about amplifying the voices of those who have been unheard and is a dedicated philanthropist. He serves on the board of the Council of Korean Americans. Welcome to the Forever Learning Institute, Hosea.
Thank you so much, Tish. I'm really excited to be moderating this discussion today with Professor Kevin White, professor of the practice of business administration at Fuqua and former vice president and director of athletics for Duke from 2008 until his retirement in 2021. I'm also thrilled to introduce Professor Tracie Canada, an Andrew W. Mellon Assistant Professor of Cultural Anthropology and Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. Professor Canada is also affiliated with the Sports and Race Project and the director and founder of the Health, Ethnography, and Race Through Sports, or HEARTS. I love that acronym, by the way, or HEARTS Lab. So with those intros aside, if we're ready to get this going, I'm going to start with Kevin here, if you don't mind. I'm going to ask both of y'all this question, but can you start off by talking about your experience at Duke?
Yeah, first of all, let me just say, Hosea, it's great to meet you on Zoom, and thrilled to have this opportunity to engage in this topic with my colleague, Dr. Canada and Tish and the Centennial team. Thanks for the kind invitation to be with you tonight. You know, Duke has been very good to me. I mean, I feel like, I excuse the expression, but I feel like I held up a Brinks truck. It's put me in a very strong position within the collegiate athletics community. And, you know, I've done this for a long time, or I did it as an athletics director. I was an athletics director actually for 38 years and had coached primarily track and field for the previous 9 years. And then, of course, I've taught at the university level for 43 years, a sports management program. And for the last 25 years, I've taught it at the MBA level. So I've been around it a lot, and I think it's because of the strong brand of the institutions I represented and or served have put me in that kind of a position. So I'm very thankful for the invitation back in 2008 to come to Duke, and it's really served I think my interests, if not my family, pretty darn well to this point.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Tracie, if you don't mind, love to hear what your experience with Duke was like.
Yeah, I would love to tell you about it. And to follow up on what Kevin was saying, thanks everybody for being here, for spending a little bit of time with us to talk through some of these issues, but also some of these like really fun things to talk about. So my name is Tracie Canada. I am a North Carolina native. And so I grew up hearing all about Duke basketball and the rivalry with UNC. And my mom is an alum of NC State. And so I knew all about all of the schools in the state. And I was fascinated by Duke because of what I saw on TV during basketball games, because basketball was such a big deal, is still such a big deal. And I'm from Greensboro, actually. So the ACC games used to be played like down the street from my high school. And so it was a big thing every year. And so I was fascinated by Duke. I wanted to go to Duke. I ended up getting into Duke. And I graduated in 2013. But funny about the way that I just told the story is by the time I got to Duke, I was not very much interested in basketball anymore. And it was because I realized that I would have to stay outside for very long periods of time in order to get into games. And I was just not interested. I didn't want a tent. I was like, I have a dorm that's like nice and warm, so I don't want to do this. So it took me about like 4 basketball games to be pretty much over that sport. And then I found football. And so during the time that I was an undergrad, I was also a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow. And for that organization, you have to have a research project. And so because I was becoming more interested in football and what the sport actually meant, I started to do research in cultural anthropology, because that was my undergraduate major, around the experiences of Black college football athletes, and thinking specifically about Duke just because that's where I was, and it was such a big basketball school. And so then I was lucky enough to come back to Duke as a professor. My first year back at Duke was the year of my 10-year reunion, and so that was like an interesting coming back point. I'm in my 3rd year as faculty now. And so it's been really, really interesting and really fun to be back on the campus that I feel like I grew up on. And my office is on East Campus, so I work where I lived as a first-year student, which is, another interesting full circle moment. But to be back at Duke has been great, given my long-standing relationship with the university that started when I was a kid, because I've heard about the team and the school forever.
Awesome. Thank you, Tracie. I'm going to go off script a little bit already. Who did you root for growing up?
I was a Duke fan. I was a Duke fan. I loved to be contrary. And so all of my friends were UNC fans. And so I was like, oh, well, why would I want to do that? And the other thing that was really interesting about it is I was the only person from my year that went to Duke from my high school. So a lot of my friends went to UNC. And so I spent a decent amount of time on UNC's, unfortunately, light blue campus. But I was the only one in the graduating class that went to Duke.
Awesome. Thank you. For this next question, this is for you, Kevin. As the director of athletics from 2008 to 2021, you led Duke athletics through some incredible changes. I graduated in 2003, and everything on that side of campus is virtually unrecognizable compared to when I was in school, just with Wallace Wade, obviously all the renovations in Cameron. We can go in a lot of different directions here, and I know we could easily spend just an hour on this topic, so we'll try to make it a little more specific. But in your role as athletic director, what were some of your guiding principles when you thought of our college athletes?
I think we really worked hard, and I think we were pretty darn effective at making it a student-athlete, high-end experience. I think that was our focus, to make darn sure that the kids that came to Duke really had a great experience. And quite frankly, that tends to help you recruit the next generation. And at Duke, even today, with Nina King running the program, which, by the way, she's a phenomenal leader and doing a great job. It's it's a serious upgrade, quite frankly, in my opinion. And I've known Nina for a couple of decades. But you've got over 700 student athletes, and those really help you recruit the next generation. And so making darn sure those kids had the experience that we talked about when we recruited them, that was probably the biggest thing we thought about. And then to kind of enhance that experience, we really needed to work on our facilities. We hadn't done anything in the facilities area in a lot of decades. Wallace Wade was built in the 30s, and Cameron Indoor was built in 1940. And there's limited things we could do in terms of premium opportunities in Cameron Indoor, but we had an opportunity to remake Wallace Wade, which we did. And a guy by the name of Roy Bostock, I don't know if Roy's on this in the room or on the Zoom tonight, but it was Roy's leadership that kind of spearheaded raising almost $500 million over all the projects that were completed. And when you think about college athletics, and all the institutions we're competing with, they're in an all-out sprint, and we were kind of playing catch up before we could get into a place, into their neighborhood, let alone to be kind of a leader on the facility front. And I'm not sure Duke ever needs to be the leader. Our brand, again, as I said in the first question, is just so darn distinctive and so strong we find ways to do it. We find it to punch way above our weight, and we do it all over the academy. By the way, that's kind of a Duke thing, and we're pretty darn good at it.
Thank you. Yeah, like I said, all the changes. It's crazy to see. Tracie, I'm really fascinated by your research in your upcoming book, Tackling the Everyday Race and Nation in Big Time College Football, which is available for pre-order. And there's love the QR code there. While social media seemingly allows us a peek behind the curtain to see the lives of our student athletes, the general public still fails to see athletes as individuals with unique backgrounds. Would you mind giving us a preview of your book and speak to some of the often overlooked aspects of being a college athlete, especially in football?
Yeah, I would love to do that. I appreciate the opportunity to do it. My book is coming out soon. And so it's, I referenced earlier that I started research. I started anthropological and ethnographic research as an undergraduate, just because that's what my major was. And then that blossomed into the thing that I worked on in grad school. And that's what this book is about. Right. And so like, it's also another interesting, like full circle moment of like, I started this research as an undergrad at Duke, and now the book is being published while I'm a faculty at Duke. So the thing that's really interesting to me about the college athlete experience is that it's pretty curated what the public knows about athletes, from my opinion. You get things on social media, you get things that athletic departments put out, you get things that ESPN either visualizes or writes about. You've got journalists that write about these things. But I was really interested in the way that I talk about it is like the everyday lives of athletes, right? Like what happens on like a random Tuesday when you have to go to class after you've been in practice, and then you also need to study, and then you have to figure out how to eat, and then you have to drive between campus and your apartment, and Duke has a very particular experience, but this is something that extends beyond Duke, right? Like these are, especially if we're talking about D1, Power 5 or 4, however you want to frame that football. These are very particular experiences for people who are on TV a lot, and we see them in a very particular way. But what is that? What's that every day like, right? And so I did ethnographic research, which we call it deep hanging out in anthropology. So just spending a lot of immersive time with Black college football players to see what their everyday lived experiences were, how they were navigating spending so much time on football, like what it means to pick classes and pick a major when maybe some of your classes interfere with practice times, right? How do you go about looking for an internship or planning for the future once you graduate? Do you plan on going pro? Like, what are the resources available to you? But then also, what's it like to just be like a 19, 20, 21-year-old guy like in college who just also happens to play football, right? Like that to me is the dual experience here. And so something that is really interesting to me that I kept seeing over and over again, and you kind of see it in the narratives that keep coming out. The thing that's really special and interesting to me is the relationships that the players form with each other. I think that's a really important aspect of their own experiences, right? Like these are guys that come from all over the country who some of them might have like played against each other in high school. They might be being recruited to the same places, but they probably don't know each other, right? Like it's very rare that teammates end up being high school teammates end up being teammates in college. So they don't know each other. They come from different places. They have different experiences, likely, right? But there's a very particular bond that forms between them during the time that they're in college. And something that I like to think about in the way that happens is because they recognize that they have a very unique experience that very few people have, right? So to be a college athlete, to perform at that level, to be on TV as much as they are, to be scrutinized in particular ways by the public, to have particular experiences as young Black men in football, and also like just walking through the world, to have to try to manage like being a college student and being a college athlete. These are all like very particular experiences. And so they bond in a very strong, fast, like deeply rooted way that isn't just bounded by their time in college. These are relationships that continue on. They're there for each other's weddings. They're there for each other, like the birth of each other's kids, like the jobs that they get after, like they stay in touch with these like extravagant, like text threads and these social media engagement. So the relationships that they formed with each other, I thought was really interesting. And that's one thing that I write about. And the other thing that I think is really important to highlight, which again comes out a little bit, but the relationships that they have with their families, but specifically with their mothers. And I was fascinated by how big of a deal their moms were in their lives. And it's something that ESPN might highlight on Mother's Day, right? Like they always have these spots about like their relationships with their moms. But the ways that their moms were so integral to their everyday, right? Of like, I call her on the phone every day on the way to practice, or my mom comes to every game, even if I'm not playing. Like she'll come to the home games and the away games to make sure that like she just knows that I'm there. Like she has like all this gear with my name on it, and she brings the entire family, right? Like the way that these moms were so important. And because I was interested in the everyday lives of these players, the relationships that they had with their teammates and then the relationships that they had with their moms seemed to be pretty integral to the ways that they were able to navigate this every day. And the way that I frame it is the care that they received from these people, right? Like the brothers, the players on the team were quite caring with each other, and their mothers were quite caring with them too. And so I think that that's an aspect that, again, like we sometimes hear snippets of, and also at certain points in the year, but the ways that was so integral to their everyday, I thought was really interesting.
That's fascinating. And by the way, I pre-ordered last night, so I can't wait to. I'll be honest, I'm a Kindle person, but nonetheless, I made an exception here, and I very much look forward to reading your book.
I appreciate that.
And then on that note, Kevin, you have a book coming out as well, if I understood correctly, called The Good Sport. And sorry, I'm going to go a little off script here, but I was curious, and I thought this would be a good time to ask this question. Obviously, given your extensive experience in the process of and putting the book together, I'm sure you kind of unearthed things that you may have not forgotten, wouldn't be the right way of saying it, but things that didn't seem like a big deal at the time, but as you were writing the book out, you're like, oh my gosh, this is a huge topic that I need to put more emphasis in. Is there any, you can answer it directly, or if you don't mind giving us a preview of your book as well, we'd love to hear it.
Thank you, Hosea. It's interesting. A lot of people that I had been with over the years had said at some point you got to write some of this stuff down. So it's largely a memoir, and then it's coupled with what I like to think are best practices, lessons learned, and then principles I've taught in my sports business class over those 43 years. And it's been fun. It's been back in time and for me, and revisiting a lot of those experiences, and then checking in with folks that were along the journey with me to make sure I kind of remembered it correctly, facts and so forth. So there was a lot of due diligence, and it took me about 2 years to put it together, but it's been fun. And I've been very, very blessed, as I said earlier. I represented some great schools, and I've had some great experiences. I was on the Olympic board for 8 years. I was chair of the NCAA men's basketball committee and tournament. Unfortunately, in the pandemic year when we shut it down, so I was involved in that in 2020. But I've been the president of all the associations in college athletics, and I've had, I've been really surrounded by some great people, not unlike Nina King for a long time. We've had over 30 of our people have gone on to become directors of athletics and at different places around the country, and all the conferences are represented. So, an opportunity to pull all that back together and then tie that back to my foundation, which is my ancestral background. So my book kind of comes out of Donegal, Ireland, as people will smirk if you know me well, you would know that that's not a surprise. And it kind of goes the lessons learned, and when my grandparents emigrated, and how they found the receptivity in this country. And I tie that strongly, quite frankly, to my incredible, I think, pronounced interest in race and gender. And, I wrote a dissertation way back in grad school on Title IX, and published an awful lot in the early 80s. And I've been a real big proponent of the advancement of the underrepresented populations, just because of my ancestral background. So now I've tied that together, and it worked for me. So an opportunity to record all that for the next generation to kind of think about it, to this point, has been really gratifying. My book comes out January 17th on Amazon. So that's where we're at. And the company Huron Consulting is my publisher. And I've been working with Huron in an athletics practice for the last probably 3.5 years. And I've been involved with about 35 institutions. And I was on all morning this morning having a very similar conversation with Rutgers. So they're grappling with all these crazy intercollegiate athletics things, not unlike the 35 other clients I'm involved with. But Huron is probably the biggest and best consultant for American higher education.
Awesome. Look forward to, I'm going to pre-order that as well when I have a chance afterwards. Thank you so much. This next question is going to be for both of you, but Tracie, if you don't mind answering this first, what does college athletics look like in 10 years? Will we have quote unquote student athletes, and the emphasis being on student? And do you think the future of college sports is sustainable? And I know there's a lot in that one question, so feel free to answer it however you'd like.
Yeah, that's a huge question, right? And I think that it's a question at the top of lots of people's minds. The way that I like to think about it is that, or the place where I like to start is that the U.S. college sports system is unique, right? It's the only country that has this type of system. And so I find it really hard to imagine sports not being a part of colleges and universities, just because of how old the system is, how unique it is, how transformational it actually is in this country, but also as people play outside of the country. It's deeply rooted and actually really important to the landscape of pro sports and also amateur sports in another way. So I don't see it necessarily going away, but it is, especially now and in the last, I mean, it's consistently changing, but I'll say like maybe the last like 4 or 5 years. There have been lots of really interesting changes. And so something that I see happening in the next 10 years is athletes getting more agency, getting more rights, which is like the place that we're already at. It would be interesting to see if unionization actually happens, because that's part of a conversation right now. Demographics and coaching and administration, if that changes, that would, I think, lead to like some really important changes overall. But if it starts to move in that direction and in the way that it looks, right, like there are more women becoming involved, there are more people of color, there are more Black people, just in general, right, like across the landscape or across the board. And so if that continues to happen, I think that will fundamentally change the ways that some of these, what I frame as issues, the way that some of these issues are carried out. But the last thing that I'll say to your point about the student athlete frame, and I put that in quotation marks because I don't use the phrase student athlete. That's not in my book, in my teaching. When I am talking to athletes that are in my classes, I always call them either athletes or by the sport that they play or college athletes, because I think it's a bit of a fallacy in the way that it is. I think that there's a lot of focus that's placed on athletics if you are a student who plays a sport in a college. And so I actually think that that's one of the big things that will change in the future. There's actually been a lot of conversation around that phrase itself and how it isn't accurate for what their experience is. And so I actually think in the next 10 years, we will see that phrase going away too.
Super fascinating. Kevin, it looks like
Yeah, let me in and just say, a couple of things. One, there's an insatiable interest in sport. I think that's undeniable in our country and quite frankly around the world. I had an economist, a colleague when I taught at Mendoza College of Business at Notre Dame, do a computation for me in 2015 that suggested, by the way, these numbers are interesting, that domestic sport represented back in 2015 about $985 billion a year, or 6.1% of the gross domestic product. I think that's fascinating. But even more so, the world economy, to the point of about $3 trillion a year, is impacted by sport, and or 4.7% of the global or the world economy. And so, in a senatorial hearing not long ago, I don't know who computed this analysis, but it was reported that about $17 billion a year are invested into college athletics. So the insatiable interest in this thing is crazy. And what I love to kind of think about, one of the greatest historians in our world was James Michener. And he wrote a great book, by the way, all you folks make a note of this. It was called Sport in America, and it was copywritten in 1976. And everything that's happening in college athletics, he prognosticated back in 76 that these things would occur, that conferences would no longer exist, consortiums would be developed, and their purpose would be to negotiate very large broadcast property rights, and geography would no longer matter, and rivalries would matter less. And Nita King, who co-teaches this course with me at Futrell, we talk about compression state economics, and that's all. Conference realignment is no more than mimicking or emulating corporate America. It's finding ways to amortize more resources across fewer units. Michener had it in 76. You can see it coming, and we're living it right now. And so to answer your pointed question, what's it look like? I'm afraid it's going to be very commercialized, even more so, very professionalized. Private equity's trying to get involved. I have an opinion on that. It would take me too long to download that. I don't like anything that untethers college athletics. I'm a traditionalist from the academy. I don't like that at all. And there's lots of discussions about different models that would take college athletics and move it a standard deviation or many standard deviations outside of the academy. I still believe that kids get an experience, as I call them, student athletes, that they get an experience as a student athlete they can't get anywhere else on the campus. And I think it can be life-changing, and it should be life-changing, because that's what we sell them. That's what we market to them when we get them to jump in with us and come to our schools. And so I really value all of that. And I worry about anything that would take, again, college athletics away from the academy. And that, I'm afraid that's where we're headed.
Thank you both for sharing your views there. The audience is probably wondering why we haven't talked about NIL yet. We wanted to save that for last, so that just because that in and of itself is a massive topic. So we're gonna I'm pre-warning everyone already. We're not going to do a deep dive here, but we're going to kind of skim the surface here. So Kevin, I'll start with you. You've been a leading voice in college athletics, and especially with the changes we're in the midst of with NIL, or name, image, and likeness. Would you mind sharing your thoughts as to how that's going to shape things for college athletics, specifically on the NIL point, but we'll keep it high level here.
Yeah, a really high level, very, very quickly. I have never been opposed to providing resources to student athletes. That's not the issue here. But what we have is a system, and the word of the day is without guardrails, and it's not sustainable. There's a lot of funny money. We're buying players. And, if a kid goes off in a mid-major and has a great night, he's going to get a call or two by midnight. I mean, that's what's going on here. This is the wild, wild west. It's a mess what's going on, actually. And again, as I said already, it's not sustainable. So I really worry about that. I was asked by the NCAA to chair NIL. Smartest decision I ever made. I was chairing the NCAA basketball committee at that point, and I just said, I didn't have the time, and I found a way not to do it. And it was the smartest thing I ever did. Anyway, there's so many things that we could spend a lot of time on. Transfer portal, NIL, it's very disruptive to the system. And, you see a lot of high profile coaches that are really well thought of within the industry heading in another direction. And quite frankly, the era we're in, again, is not sustainable, and that's causing a lot of the pretty significant change, at least in my opinion. And there's a lot of people, because of recruiting and other reasons, they're going to tell you everything you want to hear most favorably about NIL. But I tell you what, 2 glasses of red juice behind the bar, and they'll tell you the truth. It's not sustainable. It may kill college athletics when it's over in its form.
Got it. Thank you, Kevin. And then Tracie, how, if at all, have your thoughts on the treatment of I was about to say student athletes, both based on what you said, college athletes changed as NIL continues to evolve? Like, independent of NIL, what shifts would you like to see in college football and other sports as it relates to gender and equity?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because I mean, if we bookmark it, right, like NIL in the way that it is now, is only since 2021, right? So like, this is a very recent shift in the landscape of college sports. Is a very recent shift. And so regardless of where that is or how it changes or what it's doing, like I said, I think that there's lots of other interesting things that are happening alongside it. And because my research, like where I focus my attention is always with the athletes themselves rather than at like the university or the system level. It's really interesting to see, like I was saying, like how unionization efforts might actually change experiences for athletes on campus. How it might change that now I'll just use basketball as an example, with so many more eyes on the WNBA. and also on women's basketball, like how that might change the landscape for women's sports in general, right? Of like, what if we get more eyes on other sports, right? Like, what if there's more resources that are poured in there? What if that does actually start to mirror the ways that if there's a male sport counterpart, like what would that look like, right? If we have the same level of interest and resources attributed to women's sports, because it will start to maybe trickle down from some of the pro leagues. What happens if the NCAA is actually, they used to have a commercial that I thought was fascinating, that would talk about like their tagline for it was that 98% of our athletes will go pro in something other than sports. That was their tagline. And so if we take that seriously to say that 98% of athletes in college aren't going to go pro, hopefully we will continue to have more resources poured into, okay, so what are your options outside of sports, right? Like how can we focus on, like I was saying before, like getting you internships, networking with alums. And I think that Duke actually does a really good job with that, right? Because we've got such a deep alumni network. How can we get you connected with other people in other industries? How can we get you internships, even if, because I focus on football, even if you don't have that much time during the year for something like this, how can we try to work out 2 weeks during the summer where you can leave and you can go do an internship somewhere that might set you up for post-graduation life if you don't go pro, right? If you want to stay in sports, what are some other opportunities for you that aren't playing, but like, how can you still be involved in this, right? I think that like all of this, like the changing landscape will make everything look different, but I think that there's potential for it to be better different, right? Like, I think that there can be better opportunities for athletes themselves if we keep them at the center of it to think, okay, with all of these changes that are going on, money is potentially moving around in a different way, resources are moving around, attention is moving around. Okay, what can we do with that? And I think there's a lot of potential there.
Great, thank you. For the last set of questions here, I'm going to shift it back to Duke specific, or just specific to Duke rather. And like the title of our webinar here, we have the Duke Dynasty. Kevin, I'm curious to hear, obviously we know what you did as athletic director during your period, but nonetheless, can you, and you spoke to it, you alluded to it a little bit earlier, you previewed it, but can you speak to how exactly, well, it's hard to say exactly, but how did we build out the dynasty that we have today?
I think the people that great success at Duke in the college athletic space took full advantage of the brand. I'll think about Coach K. Mike really understood the moment, and he knew he was at a special place. And by the way, previously he was at a special place at West Point, and he took full advantage of Duke. And he built this thing. He actually built it largely by himself. It's pretty amazing what he accomplished, and recreated a brand that was good and strong of one of the really great regional universities. Now, I may offend people when I say that, back in the late 70s, early 80s, and made it not only one of the six, tied for U.S. News and World Report, sixth best university in the country this year, 13th best globally ranked, and but also made it an international school. And so, but it's Mike, and it's Duke Medicine. It's there's so many things, and a lot of our academic departments have started to get an awful lot of attention. But Duke was in a position, I think, to be leveraged, and I think when I think about college basketball and the 5 national championships, that certainly had a big impact, and that all started in the early 80s with Mike. So you got to give Mike a lot of credit.
Awesome. Thank you. Final question before we go into Q&A. And Tracie, if you don't mind, I'll start with you. As we close here, can you share with the audience how you think Duke can continue to lead in shaping college athletics? And feel free to even push back on the premise of that question if you don't feel that, be honest, if you don't think Duke's leading. But in any case, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I can answer it, and I'll actually answer it in maybe in a way that makes a lot of sense for me since I'm a professor, right? So I think one way that Duke is actually leading in an adjacent way is the fact that the university is focused on sports scholarship, because I think it's a unique combination, right? To have a university like Duke that is so focused on athletics and has like these fantastic, famous, and also like really good athletic teams. But then on the other side, on the academic side, to also have an interest and push behind having professors like me who do work in this space, right? Who think about this in other ways, who like there's a lot of curriculum changes that are going on right now at Duke. And so the fact that sports are part of that, right? That there's sport classes and sport groups of I don't know how much of the lingo people here know, but like there's lots of curriculum changes that are going on. And so there's lots of sport classes that are being included in that, right? So the fact that the university recognizes that there's something that needs to, like, that this is a dual thing, that it's great to have the athletics, and then it's also great to have like the scholarship behind it of like thinking critically about what's going on the athletic side. And I think that Duke is actually leading in that space because there's very few universities that are doing both at the same time, especially universities that are at the level of Duke on both athletics and academics, right? And the other thing that I think is actually really interesting about what Duke is doing, which kind of feeds into that, is the support that they have for students on campus. And this is for athletes and for students who don't play sports as well, right? So there's the Duke Sport Business Conference, there's Uncut Duke, there's Black and Blue, which is the faculty group that I'm a part of, there's United Black Athletes, there's the Blue Crew, right? Like there's all of these students or student and faculty organizations that the university supports as ways for athletes to get involved and to meet each other, like across teams, for athletes to talk about their own experiences, to encourage students to go to athletic events, right? To get eyes on some of these sports that don't get as much, get as much visibility as maybe basketball and football do. You've got something like My Lab, which is something that's supported by the university. The Hearts Lab is supported by the university. You've got Black and Blue, like I mentioned, which is a faculty-led organization. And so I think that there's something really important at this intersection that Duke does seem to be very invested in. And I think that that only makes all of us better, right? Like to have this athletic side and then to say like, okay, like let's think about what's actually going on here and how can we make it better for our athletes? How can we improve their experiences? How can we manage this better? Like how can we be a leader in some of these spaces that like maybe we're not doing as great at? Or how can we hook up with other universities so that we can show them better ways to do it, right? I think that Duke is doing that really well and it's actually really exciting to be a part of that.
Thanks, Tracie. Kevin, thoughts on how Duke can continue to lead?
I know we're running along here. I'll just say one or two things. Duke is just so distinctive, and that Tracie did a great job talking about the academic side of this thing. I mean, I'm going to be very braggadocious. I think the thing I'm most proud of during my time at Duke, we were the -- academically performing athletics program in the country. Unquestionable. We won all the major awards. Our kids were phenomenal. And you can use any metric you want. We were #1 in terms of academic performance. And I think that kind of separates us from everybody else. And that's why college athletics needs to stay tethered to the academy, because that means something to the academy. And it means something to these kids that'll go on and matriculate in life in lots of different directions, every direction they want to, from a place like Duke. Okay, so I think about that. And then, what can Duke do? Duke needs to be an influencer. We got a great president now who's right out of Central Casting in Vince Price, and Dick Bridehead was really perfect when he was here. And then you've got, in terms of athletics, you got Nina King, who is a serious upgrade and a big time player. And she's got people around her in the ACC, all of which were with her at other places. And I don't know if you know this or not, but, on the staff with her at Notre Dame was Bubba Cunningham, who's the AD at University of North Carolina, Boo Corrigan at NC State, most recently Alan Green at Pitt, Stan Wilcox, who was the AD at Florida State, who's now the EVP of the NCAA, and Bernard Muir, who's the AD at Stanford, and others. So Nina's already got a great network. And so if you want to influence college athletics to kind of behave like Duke, you better have a network and you better have a Nina King.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're going to enter the Q&A portion. And we already got some questions in the chat here. So I'm going to quickly try to mediate here, or moderate rather, and quickly find some questions. I see a couple of questions regarding the transfer portal. One question reads, with the transfer portal, it feels like the percentage of athletes who graduate from Duke has decreased. Do the numbers support that? And going back to what you both had spoken about in terms of the academic record of our athletes, how obviously Duke's done such a great job of that. I guess I'll I'll tinker with that question a little bit. How has the transfer portal impacted that in terms of what you see?
Yeah, and Tracie, you may have an opinion here better than mine. Yours might be research. Mine is a little anecdotal. But my instinct is 4 or 5 years from now, we're going to see graduation numbers nationally plummet because kids are moving all over the place. I read an article just yesterday. We had 24,000 kids this past year in the transfer portal. 2,400 of those 24,000 hooked up and went to another institution. Almost 65% of those 2,400 went down a level. I mean, this is not successful. And there's a lot of kids, when the music stops, they can't find a seat to put their butt in. I mean, that's what's going on here. And I really worry about, again, if you really are a believer in this process and kids are going to have a life-changing experience, when they're jumping schools in the middle of the night from one to the other, it's amazing. The third parties are calling these kids and getting them to transfer, and they're basically telling them all your credits will transfer, and the people that are making those promises have no authority. And so when you see graduation rates at some point, they'll plummet. At Duke right now, this degree means something, and I think our kids are pretty savvy consumers. They know that, and I don't think we've suffered a setback in that regard to this point. But we have a small sample size right now. I'd like to see what it looks like 4 or 5 years from now.
I can just second everything that Kevin is saying, because this isn't like a lot of the questions that are actually coming up in the portal. He's probably much better equipped to answer than I am. But the thing that's interesting to me about the transfer portal, and specifically at Duke, I think that to Kevin's point, I don't necessarily seeing affecting us that much yet. It will be interesting to see what happens in 4 to 5 years. But I think the other thing that's interesting to keep in mind with this is that certain sports are definitely more affected than other sports when it comes to the portal. And so, like, if we were to drill down, like if it's Duke students in general, then that's one thing. But then if we were to drill down on different teams, I would be interested to see like what that looks like across the teams. And because for better or worse, like they're taking advantage of something that has been now afforded to them that they did not have access to before, which is similar to, and it makes it kind of murky because of the idea that college sports are amateur, right? That they're not professional, and they're not officially professional, but it's definitely professionalized. But if we think of it in the frame of amateur sports that are becoming much more professional than I would say amateur, they're taking advantage of something that other people also have the opportunity to take part in, right? The way that coaches are able to move, and there's another question in the chat here about coaches too, the way that coaches can get recruited away, the way that professors can get recruited away, the way that students who don't play sports, they can transfer to other universities, they can transfer to other universities as well, right? And so it's an interesting space that the portal has put athletes in, because now they can take advantage of something that other people have already and always had access to. It just now, like, what does that look like, right? Like, and to Kevin's point, it's that like maybe they're not, maybe hopefully they're still graduating from school, right? Like hopefully that's still what's happening. But if they transfer away from Duke, it's not a Duke degree. And so like, what does that then look like if it's not a Duke degree? And let's say that you don't go pro, it doesn't work out for you. Now, again, hopefully you have graduated, but it's not the same degree that you would have started with. So now what does that look like for you, right? Like those are the questions that I ask. And it's not so much that I have answers to much of anything. I just ask a lot of questions because that's my role as a researcher. And so those are the questions that I'm always thinking about now that these things are changing in the way that they are.
And real quick, just to piggyback off that, Tracie, have you, or actually for both of you, have you interacted with any transfers? Like, have they taken your course for any of your courses, for instance, or do you have any anecdotal data at least? And obviously, just in terms of how their experience has been and how they're approaching and thinking about this. All right, Kevin, yeah.
I would just jump in, and the students that Nina and I have had in our class at Fuqua, they feel like it's an upgrade, that when they transfer to Duke and we've got kids from the Ivy League, we've got kids from all over the country, some really good institutions, and either they're as graduate transfers or just transfers in general. And Nina would be closer to that population than I am at this point. But I think they see coming to Duke as a pretty significant upgrade. I said it earlier, kids today are really good consumers. So if a kid's a serious student, the opportunity to come to Duke and to participate in athletics is a big deal. I mean, it really warrants their full attention. There's so many things I could say. One other digression is, over the last 10 or 15 years, we haven't had a lot of practitioners involved at the NCAA level. I talked a little bit about Vince and Dick. They were really involved with the ACC, which has been really good, and we need to have them involved to influence the behavior of everybody as we move forward, along with Nina and everybody else. But once again, for the last 15 years or so, we've become very permissive. And, I've got a lot of presidents that, because I was in it a long time, I'm an old guy, they call me and they'll say, hey, Kevin, we got to reel this back in. Well, I tell you what, you reel it back in, you're going right to court. And the last time I checked, the NCAA is like 0-50 in lawsuits. We haven't won one yet. And so we go to litigation, we're going to get beat. And, the only thing I would say, when you talk about being, again, pretty liberal on the transfer business, and I get that. I understand that. Kids should have options. But at the same time, there isn't a sporting community in the world that doesn't have restrictions, that doesn't have guardrails. And I don't know how you operate across, in the NCAA, for instance, 365 Division I schools, and or the NCAA in as a parent organization, 1,100 schools with 500,000 student athletes. That's why you got 24,000 in the portal, because there are no rules. And the NBA couldn't operate that way. The NHL, Major League Baseball, NFL, nobody could operate that way. So you got to have some rules to have an athletics enterprise to function effectively. And right now we don't. We're without any structure, without any rules.
Tracie, in case you had anything you want to add to that, or are you good there?
No, all good.
Just in terms of any adding data. Okay, great. This next question, I think this is going to be more for Kevin. How will the Olympic sports mitigate travel concerns now that those teams are traveling to Cal, Stanford, obviously out to the West Coast? Not all Duke teams have chartered flights like football and basketball. Yeah,
it's a great and a serious question, because again, the kids that come to Duke are serious students, and so they're going to be worried about being able to kind of keep up academically. That'll be a priority, and it always has been. So I'm not in those meetings at this point. But a lot of the Olympic sports, by the way, were going to the West Coast once or twice, at least once a year, maybe twice a year. And so if in fact the trips they were taking now, if they're Cal, they're Stanford, or they're down to Dallas to SMU or whatever, maybe there's a way to kind of move the schedule around to be less dramatically difficult. I don't know, but I worry about it. Of course I do. But it takes me back to 1976. Michener said this would happen. And I don't know who the hell he was talking to. I don't know who he was having 2 glasses of grape juice behind the barn. But when he prognosticated all this, and it's all come to form, it's a great read, by the way, in 2024 to read his book. But here's where we are. Geography no longer matters. Conferences really don't exist the way they used to. They become consortia, and they're all about generating more and more broadcast property rights.
Can I add to that a little bit?
Oh, absolutely.
And I agree with everything that Kevin's saying. The thing that because this is a conference realignment issue, and the thing that I was always have been consistently thinking about with the realignments is, at least the way that I understand it, a lot of it had to do with football. It was kind of a football decision. And it's a little bit easier to deal with their schedules because they play on a pretty consistent basis. Football plays sometimes on Friday, but usually on Saturday. And their travel schedules are usually a little bit more consistent. You kind of know when they're going to go out of town. You kind of know when they're going to come back. Adding in especially if we're talking about the ACC, adding in these California schools on their side or on our side, you're dealing with huge time difference jumps. You're dealing with huge, very long flights. which is disruptive, right? Like that's incredibly disruptive of maybe they have to leave classes earlier now, right? Like in order to make these trips. Maybe they are definitely jet lagged when they come back on Monday, right? Like, so those were the questions that I was thinking about because I focus on football. But then if you add in other sports, right, that don't have as consistent of schedules when they play every other day, right? Like, which is some of the sports, depending on the semester, like they're playing every other day, it seems, every other, maybe like every 2 days, right? And they have to travel, they have to deal with this. They're not chartered flights, and so they are dealing with like a whole different transportation schedule and system. Those are actually the sports that I worried about much more than football, even though to me it seemed like a football decision, because our athletes, like how are they going to handle that, right? Like, how are they going to keep up with schoolwork? How are they going to keep up with schoolwork because they're like having to do it on a plane, but also because now they're missing more classes? How are they going to deal with this like extraneous travel on their bodies? Because it's also like a very, and like I'm actually currently in California. Like being on a plane for that long is like a lot, and so to like to be on a plane consistently for long periods of time, to have to do that multiple times, potentially a semester. Those are the things that I'm really curious to see how that plays out, and I think it will take a couple of years to see like the actual effects of this. But even there's data that's come out, and I teach a sport class in the fall, and so it was probably 2 months ago, there was data that was coming out about, I want to say it was volleyball teams. Like there was a volleyball team that had racked up like a ridiculous amount of miles traveling across the country to go to all of their games. And so it was just like putting numbers on it, and to see those numbers in black and white of like, oh, wow, this is like a whole different type of schedule that they're now having to deal with because of the way that the conferences are realigning. It was really interesting to see those numbers. And so, like I was saying, like I think it'll take a little bit of time to actually see, like, okay, comparing to before the realignment and after, like how many more miles are these teams traveling, how many more hours are spent on travel, how much extra class is being missed, like all of those numbers I think are going to take a minute to come out. But that's the stuff that I'm thinking about with that, not just because of not having chartered flights, but also how is that experience affecting the athletes themselves when they're having to deal with all of the stuff at the same time?
Can I underscore something that Tracie said? I agree. It's all driven by football entirely. And by the way, for every college television dollar, about 85% is attributable to football. About 15% is attributable to men's basketball and everything else. And when you think about men's basketball, we're a basketball school, a very proud basketball school. Again, I don't want to get off on that again, but the bottom line is there's just so much inventory in basketball, 350 or 365 institutions. Those networks and those cable entities don't draw large enough audiences to monetize those broadcast property rights in the same way they monetize them in football. With that said, I'm gonna come on the other side and just say it's interesting, since conference realignment this last round, as it's impacted Big Ten and the schools and the ACC, are in the aggregate, our ratings are down in both of those conferences because athletics is tribal and athletics is opposed to Michener's research. It is geographically influenced. And so the numbers, conference realignment has just occurred, and those television audiences in the aggregate at this point are down last year, and they're supposed to be down this year. I just had somebody in my class the other night giving me good data on those numbers, which is counterintuitive. You would think when you add LA and you would add Dallas and you would add Silicon Valley that your numbers would go up, but that you're not drawing. You're drawing smaller audiences. It's not that you thought you could kind of keep the same trajectory. These are actually smaller audiences last year and also this year. It's fascinating. So who knows what the recipe is, the right recipe?
Thank you. We have a hard stop here around in about 2 minutes. And so I'm doing a terrible job as a moderator by making this our last question. So as short as possible, I guess, but it's a terrible question for a short response. But in an ideal world, given everything that we just discussed in terms of the future of college athletics, where do these rules, where should they come from? At the NCAA, federal government, state government? Again, I apologize ahead of time. I did warn you. That's a terrible final question for me to throw at you guys.
Well, Jose, argue vehemently for we need more practitioner involvement. The NCAA, we had I call it the Camelot era in the 90s when Cedric Dempsey, who had been the AD at Arizona, was the executive director of the NCAA, and a Dookie by the name of Gene Corrigan, who was the ACC commissioner, was the president from the membership of the NCAA. But we had two very long time, well-seasoned, whiskered practitioners. We need more practitioners in this thing.
Thanks. And then Tracie, if you don't mind with the final words here, in terms of, again, who do you think is best suited to represent athletes then at that? Yeah, I know it's a tough question. I'm sorry.
Softball there. Potentially and maybe this is like a good answer to this question, because I was thinking about it. I was like, I don't actually know if I have a good answer to this. But if the question is like, who's the best to advocate for athletes, I would say athletes themselves. And so current athletes and some of them call themselves retired or athletes who have graduated, right? Like that group of people, because I think that they know their experiences better than anyone else, right? Like I can research this all day and long, but I never played a sport in college. I didn't play a sport at all. And so I can have all of these ideas, but I really don't know the intricacies of what this actually looks like in their day to day, how it's actually affected, right? Like I can theorize it all day long, but I'm always going to advocate for athletes themselves being able to speak to their own experiences and potentially shape that to make it better for themselves and then the generations that come up behind them. So I'll say to advocate for athletes themselves.
I would account for athletes in my practitioner group. Definitely have to have athlete involvement.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. I'm going to hand it off to Tish here to close this out. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Tracie, Kevin, and Hosea for such a great session, and to our audience for joining us this evening.